The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop, throwing Sarah McKenna against the worn leather seat as a cloud of red dust billowed through the open window. She pressed her handkerchief to her nose, squinting through the haze at what the driver had optimistically called Cedar Ridge. After 3 weeks of bone-jarring travel from Boston, this collection of weathered buildings scattered across the Arizona desert seemed more like a mirage than a destination. "End of the line, miss," called the driver, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Cedar Ridge, Arizona Territory." Sarah gathered her carpetbag and stepped down onto the packed earth, her dark blue traveling dress already collecting dust, despite her careful attention to appearance. The late September sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel sweat beading beneath the high collar she'd thought appropriate for meeting her new employer. Around her the town sprawled in all directions. A saloon with bat-wing doors that creaked in the desert wind, a general store with a crooked sign, and a handful of adobe houses that seemed to melt into the landscape. "You the new school, Mom?" A gravelly voice made her turn. A tall man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached, his pale eyes taking in her appearance with undisguised skepticism. His weathered face bore the marks of too many years under the desert sun, and his hand rested casually on the grip of his Colt revolver. "I am Sarah McKenna," she replied, extending her gloved hand. "You must be Sheriff Morrison." Dutch Morrison took her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her glove. "Dutch'll do fine. You sure you know what you're getting into out here? This ain't Boston, miss. We got Apaches stirring up trouble, and folks here don't take kindly to outside ideas." Sarah straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze directly. "I assure you, Sheriff, I'm quite prepared for the challenges of frontier education. The children of Cedar Ridge deserve the same quality of learning as those anywhere else." A harsh laugh escaped Morrison's lips. "Quality education? Most of these kids are lucky if they can write their own names. What they need is to learn how to survive, not fancy book learning that won't help them when the Apaches come calling." Before Sarah could respond, a woman emerged from the general store, her simple cotton dress and sun-weathered hands marking her as someone who belonged to this harsh landscape. Her dark hair was streaked with premature gray, and her brown eyes held a warmth that contrasted sharply with the sheriff's cold assessment. "You must be Miss McKenna," the woman said, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. "I'm Elena Martinez. My husband Carlos and I run the store, and we've been looking forward to your arrival. The children need someone who believes in them." Sarah felt a surge of relief at the genuine welcome. "Mrs. Martinez, it's wonderful to meet you. I hope to begin classes as soon as possible. The schoolhouse is just there." Elena pointed to a small adobe building at the edge of town. "It's been empty for 2 years since our last teacher left. Too isolated," she said. "Too dangerous." Her voice carried a note of disapproval that didn't seem directed at the departed teacher. Sheriff Morrison spat into the dust. "Last teacher had sense. Left after a few Apache raids, got too close for comfort. These people," he jerked his head toward Elena, "they think book learning matters more than staying alive." Sarah observed the tension between the sheriff and Mrs. Martinez, filing it away as something to understand better. In Boston, she'd taught children from immigrant families who faced prejudice daily, and she recognized the familiar dynamics of power and discrimination even in this remote setting. "Perhaps," Sarah said carefully, "education and safety aren't mutually exclusive. Knowledge can be its own form of protection." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Pretty words, miss. But out here, the only protection that matters comes from this." He patted his revolver. "You do well to remember that Apache don't care much for fancy talk." As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted from the direction of the saloon. Men shouted, and Sarah heard the sound of horses approaching fast. A group of riders thundered into town, dust flying from their horses' hooves. At their head rode a man in a cavalry uniform, his blue coat faded but his bearing still military straight. "Trouble, Sheriff," the cavalry officer called out, reining in his horse near where they stood. "Captain James Fletcher, stationed at Fort Apache. We've been tracking a war party that hit a ranch north of here yesterday. They got away, but we managed to capture one of them." Sarah watched as 2 soldiers dismounted and roughly pulled a young Apache man from the back of a pack horse where he'd been tied face down. Even from a distance, she could see that he was badly beaten, his dark hair matted with blood. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Sheriff Morrison grinned, an expression that chilled Sarah's blood. "Well now, Captain, looks like we finally got ourselves a live one. I'll get the information we need out of him, don't you worry." The young Apache was dragged toward the jail, his legs barely supporting him. As they passed close to where Sarah stood, she saw his eyes, dark, defiant, and utterly without hope. Something in that gaze struck her like a physical blow, reminding her of students she'd known who'd faced impossible odds but refused to surrender their dignity. "That boy's hurt," she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Morrison turned slowly, his pale eyes now openly hostile. "That boy is a savage who helped murder 3 innocent people yesterday, including a woman and her child. He'll get exactly what he deserves." "Nevertheless," Sarah pressed, her teaching instincts overriding her common sense, "surely basic medical attention—" "Miss McKenna." Morrison's voice carried a warning that made Elena Martinez step protectively closer to Sarah. "I suggest you worry about your schoolchildren and leave Apache justice to those who understand it." As the soldiers disappeared into the jail with their prisoner, Sarah felt the weight of every watching eye in the town. She had been in Cedar Ridge less than an hour, and already she had marked herself as someone who asked uncomfortable questions. In the distance, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with the first hints of autumn color. Somewhere among those peaks, she knew, other Apache were waiting, wondering what had become of the young warrior now locked in Morrison's jail. The sun continued its relentless assault on the desert, but Sarah McKenna had stopped noticing the heat. Her attention was fixed on the jail, where she could already hear the sound of raised voices and something that might have been a cry of pain. Chapter 2. Lines in the Sand. Sarah spent her first night in Cedar Ridge in a small room above the Martinez General Store, listening to the sounds of the desert through thin walls. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices eerily human in the darkness, while closer to town, she could hear the occasional shout from the saloon and the heavy footsteps of men moving between buildings. But what kept her awake was the memory of the young Apache's eyes and the sounds that had drifted from the jail until well past midnight. Dawn came with a harsh beauty that took her breath away. The mountains stood silhouetted against a sky painted in shades of gold and crimson, and for a moment, Sarah understood why people chose to build lives in this unforgiving place. She dressed carefully in her simplest skirt and white blouse, braided her brown hair back severely, and made her way downstairs to where Elena Martinez was already preparing breakfast. "You didn't sleep well," Elena observed, setting a cup of strong coffee before Sarah. It wasn't a question. "The sounds from the jail," Sarah admitted. "Is that normal?" Eleanor's face hardened. "Sheriff Morrison has his own ideas about justice. Captain Fletcher returned to the fort last night, and without army oversight. She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. Surely there are laws even here. Rules about the treatment of prisoners?" "Miss McKenna," Elena sat across from her, lowering her voice. "You seem like a good woman, someone who cares about right and wrong. But out here, Sheriff Morrison is the law. The territorial governor is hundreds of miles away, and the army only cares about results." "What happens in that jail?" She shrugged helplessly. Sarah sipped her coffee, thinking, "Tell me about the Apache, the ones who live near here." Eleanor glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone. "Most of them are trying to make peace. They know the old ways are ending. There's a small band led by an elder named Nalnish who's been negotiating with the Indian Agency, trying to get his people settled on the reservation without more bloodshed. But there are younger warriors who refuse to surrender, who would rather die fighting than live caged." "And the boy in the jail?" "Ayana. His name means eternal blossom in Apache. He's Nalnish's nephew, barely out of boyhood but proud like his ancestors. The raid yesterday," Eleanor paused. "It wasn't random violence, Miss McKenna. Morrison's been pushing the Apache, taking their water sources, allowing ranchers to graze cattle on sacred grounds. Yesterday was retaliation, but Morrison will use it to justify whatever he wants to do." The implications settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. In Boston, injustice had been subtle, hidden behind legal language and social conventions. Here, it was as stark and brutal as the landscape itself. "I should prepare the schoolhouse," Sarah said finally. "When do the children usually arrive?" "Most come around 8 after morning chores." "But Miss McKenna," Eleanor caught her arm gently. "Be careful who you trust. This town has good people, but it also has those who profit from fear and hatred. Morrison has supporters, men who believe that the only good Apache is a dead Apache." Sarah nodded and made her way to the schoolhouse, a adobe building that sat slightly apart from the main street. Inside, wooden benches faced a simple desk, and morning light streamed through 2 small windows. Someone had left a few books, McGuffey's Readers mostly, and a battered copy of Webster's Speller. On the blackboard, written in a child's careful hand, were the words, "Welcome, Teacher," surrounded by drawings of flowers. She was arranging the books when she heard footsteps outside. 3 children peered shyly through the doorway, 2 Mexican boys who looked to be brothers, and a pale girl with corn silk hair who clutched a corn-husk doll. "Are you the new teacher?" asked the older boy in careful English. "I am. Please come in. I'm Miss McKenna." They filed in hesitantly, taking seats in the front row. The girl whispered something to the younger boy in rapid Spanish, and he nodded seriously before translating. "Maria wants to know if you'll stay. The last teacher left when the Apache trouble started." Sarah knelt to meet Maria's eyes. "I plan to stay as long as you'll have me." "What's your name?" "Maria Consuela Martinez," the girl whispered. "Elena is my mama. And these are my brothers," the older boy added. "I'm Diego, and this is Roberto. We can read some English, but Mama says you'll teach us more." "I certainly will. And you'll teach me things too. That's how the best learning happens." More children began arriving. A rancher's son with his sister, 2 children whose father worked at the livery stable, and eventually a total of 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. Sarah began with simple introductions, but her concentration was broken when angry voices erupted from the direction of the jail. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see a small crowd gathering. Sheriff Morrison stood on the jail's front step, addressing the group with animated gestures. Even from a distance, his voice carried clearly in the dry air. "Enough of their raids and murder. Time to send a message that'll reach every Apache from here to Mexico." Diego Martinez had moved to stand beside Sarah at the window. "They're talking about Ayana," he said quietly. "Mama told me what happened yesterday. Do you know him? The prisoner?" The boy nodded reluctantly. "Sometimes Apache come to our store to trade. Ayana has been there with his uncle. He's not a killer, Miss McKenna. He's just angry. His little sister died last winter from white man's diseases, and his uncle couldn't get medicine because they wouldn't trade with Apache anymore." Sarah felt her heart constrict. How old was his sister? Maybe 5 or 6, same as Maria. The crowd outside was growing larger, and Sarah could see several men she didn't recognize, rough-looking types who might have ridden in from outlying ranches. Their voices were getting louder, more aggressive. Words like justice and example drifted through the morning air, but the tone suggested something far removed from any justice Sarah recognized. "Children," she said, turning back to her students, "I want you to continue with your reading. Practice the words we just learned." But even as she tried to focus on teaching, Sarah found herself thinking about Ayana, alone in that jail cell, probably wondering if he would live to see another sunset. She thought about Elena's words about lines being drawn, and Morrison's supporters who wanted to send a message. Most of all, she thought about a 5-year-old Apache girl who had died while medicine sat locked away from her people. Outside, the crowd was dispersing, but Sarah noticed that several men remained near the jail, including Morrison. They seemed to be making plans, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Whatever they were discussing, Sarah was certain it didn't bode well for the young Apache warrior. As the morning wore on and her students worked through their lessons, Sarah McKenna found herself facing a choice she hadn't expected to make so soon. She could focus on her teaching, keep her head down and avoid the dangerous currents that swirled through Cedar Ridge, or she could acknowledge that sometimes the most important lessons happened outside the classroom. The decision, she realized, had already been made the moment she looked into Ayana's defiant, hopeless eyes. Chapter 3. The Weight of Conscience. By midday, the desert heat had driven most of Cedar Ridge indoors, but Sarah could see that the group of men around the jail had only grown larger. During the lunch break, while her students scattered to their homes for food and rest, she approached Elena Martinez, who was sweeping dust from her store's front steps with mechanical precision, a sure sign of worry. "They're planning something," Elena said without preamble, not looking up from her sweeping. "Carlos heard them talking at the saloon last night. Morrison's been telling anyone who'll listen that this is the perfect opportunity to teach the Apache a lesson they won't forget." Sarah felt her stomach clench. What kind of lesson? Elena finally met her eyes, and Sarah saw fear there. "The kind that ends with a rope and a tree, Miss McKenna. They're calling it justice, but what they're planning—" She shook her head. "It's murder, plain and simple." "But surely there are procedures. A trial, the territorial courts." "The nearest territorial judge is in Tucson, 3 days' ride. Morrison knows that Apache warriors don't live long enough to see trials. Elena's voice carried the bitter weight of experience. He's done this before 2 years ago. A young Apache caught stealing cattle, or so Morrison claimed. By the time anyone could question it, the boy was dead and buried. Sarah stared across the dusty street toward the jail, where Ayana had been imprisoned for nearly 18 hours. Through the small barred window, she thought she could see movement, proof that the young warrior was still alive. For now. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. The older woman stopped sweeping, giving Sarah her full attention. If someone were to intervene, would they have any support in this town, or would they be standing completely alone? Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. Carlos and I, we believe in doing what's right, regardless of the cost. There are others, Sam Henderson at the livery stable, Dr. Patricia Wells, a few of the Mexican families. But Miss McKenna, you have to understand, Morrison has the law on his side, at least on paper. And some of the Anglo ranchers, they genuinely believe that the only way to protect their families is to eliminate the Apache threat entirely. What about Captain Fletcher? Surely the army wouldn't condone a lynching. Fletcher returned to Fort Apache this morning. Even if he were here, the army's policy is to let local law enforcement handle captured Indians. They wash their hands of it. Eleanor's expression hardened. It's convenient for them. They can maintain they follow proper procedures while letting Morrison do their dirty work. Sarah nodded slowly, pieces of a plan forming in her mind. It was dangerous, potentially suicidal, but the alternative was to stand by while an innocent young man was murdered in the name of frontier justice. Elena, I need to know exactly where Ayana's uncle camps with his band, and I need to know if there's any way to get a message to them. Elena's eyes widened. Miss McKenna, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that sometimes the right thing to do is also the most dangerous thing to do. The afternoon session with her students was torture. Sarah went through the motions of teaching grammar and arithmetic, but her mind was racing through possibilities and problems. How could she get into the jail? How could she get word to Nalnish about his nephew's situation? And perhaps most importantly, how could she do any of this without getting herself killed in the process? The answer came from an unexpected source. After school ended and the children had departed, young Diego Martinez lingered behind, fidgeting with his slate. Miss McKenna, can I ask you something? Of course, Diego. You're thinking about helping Ayana, aren't you? Sarah hesitated. Involving a child in something this dangerous went against every instinct she had as a teacher. But Diego's serious brown eyes held an intelligence and maturity that reminded her this wasn't Boston, and frontier children grew up fast. What makes you think that? The way you keep looking at the jail. And Mama's been worried all day. She gets that look when she's trying to decide whether to do something dangerous. Diego stepped closer, lowering his voice. I know where Nalnish camps. I've been there with my papa when he trades with them, and I know the back way to the jail. Diego, I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. His young voice carried a determination that would have been admirable if it weren't so terrifying. Ayana helped my cousin once when he got lost in the desert. Apache don't forget debts, but neither do we. Sarah knelt to meet the boy's eyes. Diego, what we're talking about could get us both killed. Your parents would never forgive me if something happened to you. My parents raised me to stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. Besides, he added with a slight grin, Mama's already planning to help. She sent Roberto to get Dr. Wells and asked Papa to gather some of the other men. You won't be standing alone, Miss McKenna. The realization that Elena had already set wheels in motion both relieved and terrified Sarah. She was no longer just contemplating a lone act of conscience. She was becoming part of a conspiracy that could tear the town apart. What exactly did your mother have in mind? A distraction. Tonight, around midnight, when Morrison's drunk and most of his supporters have gone home. Papa and the other men will start a fight at the saloon. Nothing too serious, just enough to draw attention. While Morrison's dealing with that, you and Mama can get to Ayana. And then what? Even if we free him, where can he go? Morrison will hunt him down. Diego's expression grew grave. That's where I come in. There's an old mine shaft about 5 miles north of here in the foothills. It's hidden and has water. Ayana could hide there while I ride to his uncle's camp. Nalnish could get him safely away, maybe across the border into Mexico. Sarah stood slowly, her mind reeling. The plan was dangerous, complicated, and relied on perfect timing. If anything went wrong, They would all face Morrison's wrath and probably his rope. "Diego, I need you to understand something. If we do this, there's no going back. Morrison will know we were involved and he won't forgive it. Your family might have to leave Cedar Ridge." "Miss McKenna," Diego said quietly, "if we don't do this, we'll have to live with watching an innocent man die. Mama says that kind of guilt follows you forever." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah McKenna stood at the crossroads of her conscience. In a few hours, she would either be part of a desperate rescue attempt, or she would lie in bed, listening to the sounds of a lynch mob. The choice, she realized, had been made the moment she decided that some principles were worth dying for. "Tell your mother," she said finally, "that I'll be ready." Chapter 4. Shadows and Courage. The hours until midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah lay fully clothed on her narrow bed above the Martinez store, listening to the sounds of the town settling into its nighttime rhythms. The saloon was busy. More voices than usual drifted through the warm air, suggesting that word of the planned justice had drawn men from the surrounding ranches. Every so often, she heard Morrison's distinctive laugh, harsh and triumphant. At 11:30, a soft tap on her door made her heart race. Elena Martinez stood in the hallway, dressed in dark clothing and carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Carlos and the others are in position," Elena whispered. "Dr. Wells is waiting with a horse at the old corral behind her clinic. Diego has already slipped out. He'll be at the mine before we get there with Ayana." Sarah nodded, accepting the bundle. Inside, she found a dark shawl and a small medical kit. "Elena, are you sure about this? Once we start—" "I've been sure since yesterday morning when I saw them drag that boy into town like a piece of meat." Elena's voice carried a steel that Sarah hadn't heard before. "My grandmother told me stories about the old country, about standing by while innocent people were murdered. She made me promise I would never be that kind of bystander." They crept down the back stairs and into the alley behind the store. The moon was new, leaving the night dark, except for the scattered light from windows and the distant glow from the saloon. Sarah could hear the voices more clearly now, men's laughter, the clink of glasses, and underlying it all, a current of barely controlled violence. The jail sat at the far end of the main street, a simple adobe building with iron bars over two small windows. Morrison typically slept in a cot in the front office, leaving prisoners locked in the single cell at the back of the building. Tonight, however, his cot was empty. He was clearly holding court at the saloon, enjoying his role as the town's defender against Apache savagery. Elena produced a key ring from her shawl. "Carlos made copies years ago, when Morrison first got elected. We hoped we'd never need them." "You've been planning this for a long time," Sarah realized. "Not this specifically. But we knew someday Morrison would go too far, and when he did, we wanted options." Elena tested several keys before finding the right one. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence. Inside, the jail was pitch black and reeked of unwashed bodies and fear. Sarah fumbled for the matches Elena had given her, striking one carefully. In the flickering light, she saw Ayana curled in the corner of the cell, his hands and feet bound with rope. His face was a mass of bruises, and dried blood caked his hair. "Ayana," Elena whispered in Spanish, then switched to what Sarah assumed was Apache. The young warrior's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he recognized the danger and opportunity of their presence. Sarah knelt beside him as Elena unlocked the cell, pulling out the medical supplies Dr. Wells had provided. "We're going to get you out of here," she said softly, "but you'll need to trust us completely." Ayana's dark eyes fixed on her face, searching. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "Why would you do this? I am your enemy." "No," Sarah said firmly, cutting the ropes that bound his wrists. "You're just someone who needs help." Eleanor was keeping watch at the door, her body tense with concentration. "They're still at the saloon, but we need to move quickly. Dawn comes early, and Morrison will want to finish this before the sun gets too high." As Sarah helped Ayana to his feet, she could see the full extent of his injuries. His left arm hung at an odd angle, likely broken, and he moved with the careful gait of someone with cracked ribs. But his eyes were alert, and when she offered her shoulder for support, he accepted it without false pride. "There's a horse waiting behind Dr. Wells' clinic," Elena explained as they made their way toward the back door. "Diego is already at the hiding place, and he'll take you to your uncle tomorrow night." "My uncle believes I am dead," Ayana said, his voice tight with pain. "The soldiers said they would tell him I was shot trying to escape." Then it will be a happy reunion, Sarah said, surprised by her own words. 3 days ago she had been a Boston schoolteacher whose biggest concern was lesson plans. Now she was helping a wounded Apache warrior escape from jail while armed men planned his execution. They reached the back door, and Elena peered out carefully. The alley was empty, but from the direction of the saloon they could hear voices growing louder and more aggressive. Carlos and his friends would need to start their distraction soon. "Miss McKenna," Ayana said softly, "if we are caught, you must say I forced you. Morrison might believe—" "Morrison can believe whatever he likes," Sarah interrupted, "but I won't lie about why I'm here." As if summoned by her words, a commotion erupted from the saloon. Shouting voices, the crash of furniture, and Morrison's roar of authority as he tried to restore order. Eleanor smiled grimly. Carlos always did know how to start a good fight. They slipped into the alley and began making their way toward Dr. Wells' clinic, staying in the shadows and moving as quickly as Ayana's injuries would allow. Behind them, the sounds of the saloon brawl were drawing men from all over town, exactly as planned. Dr. Wells was waiting as promised, a small, severe woman in her 50s who had come west after losing her husband in the war. She helped Ayana onto the horse without questions, her practiced hands quickly checking his injuries. "The arm's broken, but it's a clean break," she reported quietly. "The ribs will heal, and the head wounds look worse than they are. He'll live if infection doesn't set in." "Doctor," Ayana said formally, "I will remember this kindness. Just remember to stay alive, young man. That's payment enough." Sarah mounted behind him, surprised by how natural it felt. In Boston, she had ridden occasionally in proper side-saddle fashion. This was different, dangerous, urgent, and somehow more honest. "Elena," she said, looking down at the woman who had risked everything for a stranger's conscience. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, Miss McKenna. Thank me when you're both safe and Morrison is still wondering what happened to his prisoner." As they rode into the desert darkness, Sarah could hear the sounds of the fight at the saloon beginning to die down. Soon, Morrison would return to the jail and discover his empty cell. By sunrise, every man in 3 counties would be hunting for an escaped Apache and the people who had helped him. But for now, under the vast canopy of desert stars, Sarah McKenna felt something she had never experienced in her careful, planned life in Boston. She felt the fierce joy of knowing she had chosen the right side, regardless of the consequences. Behind them, Cedar Ridge began to fade into the darkness, its lights growing smaller and more distant. Ahead lay the mountains, ancient and implacable, holding secrets and promises that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Chapter 5. Feathers of Honor. The mine shaft sat hidden in a fold of red rock, invisible until you were almost upon it. Diego had chosen well. Water seeped from the stone walls into a natural basin, and the entrance was concealed by a screen of hardy desert brush. As Sarah helped Ayana from the horse, she could see the wisdom in the boy's choice. Even if Morrison's men searched this area, they would likely pass by without noticing the opening. Diego emerged from the shadows, his young face grave with responsibility. "I've got supplies hidden inside, and I scouted the route to my uncle's camp. But Miss McKenna, there's something you need to know. Morrison found the empty jail an hour ago. He's already got men out searching, and he's offering a $50 reward for information about who helped the savage escape." Sarah felt her heart sink. $50 was more money than most people in Cedar Ridge saw in 6 months. Someone would talk, if only out of desperation. "Did he suspect your family?" "Not yet. Papa's fight at the saloon gave them good cover. Everyone saw the Martinez men busy with their own troubles, but he's questioning everyone, and he's—" Diego hesitated. "He's very angry, Miss McKenna, angrier than I've ever seen him." Inside the mine, Ayana settled carefully against the stone wall while Dr. Wells had given them instructions for treating his injuries. The broken arm needed to be immobilized, and Sarah worked by candlelight to fashion a proper sling from strips of cloth. "You should go back," Ayana said as she worked. "Both of you. Morrison will know someone helped me, but if you return to town now, you might still avoid suspicion." Diego shook his head firmly. "I'm taking you to your uncle tomorrow night. That was the plan." "Plans change when people's lives are at stake," Ayana replied. "I can find my own way to Nalnish's camp. I've been traveling these mountains since I could walk." Sarah tied off the sling and sat back on her heels. "With a broken arm and cracked ribs, in country that Morrison's men will be scouring, you wouldn't make it 5 miles. For the first time since his capture, Ayana smiled, an expression that transformed his battered face. "You are very stubborn, teacher. It's served me well so far." They spent the rest of the night in the mine, taking turns keeping watch while the others rested. As dawn approached, Diego prepared to return to town, carrying Sarah's message that she had gone for an early morning walk and would return shortly. It was a thin story, but it might buy them time. "Be careful," Sarah told him. "Morrison will be looking for any excuse to take out his anger on someone. I'll be fine. Papa says Morrison's smart enough not to hurt Mexican families without proof. He needs their labor too much. But Miss McKenna, you can't come back to town. Not now. Morrison will be watching everyone too closely." The boy was right, and Sarah knew it. Her teaching career in Cedar Ridge was over before it had truly begun. The thought should have devastated her, but instead, she felt an odd sense of liberation. For the first time in her life, she had acted purely on conscience without considering the consequences for her reputation or her future. Diego disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving Sarah alone with Ayana as the sun began to paint the eastern horizon in shades of gold and crimson. In the growing light, she could see his injuries more clearly, the careful way he held his left side, the swelling around his right eye that had closed it entirely. "Tell me about your sister," she said softly, "the one who died." Ayana was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of grief that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Izianzin, little flower. She was bright, like sunlight on water, always laughing, always asking questions. When the sickness came to our camp, the white doctor in Tucson had medicine that could have saved her, but they would not trade with Apache, not even for a child's life." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, knowing the words were inadequate. "My uncle tried to make peace. He signed papers, agreed to move our people to the reservation. But men like your sheriff, they do not want peace. They want us gone, all of us, so they can take our land without guilt." Ayana turned to look at her directly. "Why did you help me? You could have lived your life safely, teaching your children, never knowing what happened in that jail." Sarah considered the question, recognizing its importance. "Because I looked into your eyes and saw someone who deserved better than what he was getting. Because silence in the face of injustice makes us all complicit. And because—" she paused, surprised by her own clarity. "Because sometimes you have to choose between being safe and being able to live with yourself." The sound of horses approaching interrupted their conversation. Sarah peered carefully through the brush screening the mine entrance and counted at least 6 riders moving along the valley floor below. Even at a distance, she could see Morrison's tall figure on his distinctive black horse. "They're searching systematically," she whispered. "They'll reach this area by afternoon." Ayana struggled to his feet, testing his balance. "Then we leave now. In daylight it's dangerous, but staying here is worse. Diego said your uncle's camp is 8 miles northeast in the canyon beyond Lookout Rock. Nalnish will have scouts watching the approaches. If Morrison's men follow us—" Ayana shook his head. "Too many people will die." Sarah looked at the young Apache warrior, seeing not the savage that Morrison and his supporters described, but a man trapped between 2 worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. An idea began forming, dangerous, probably foolish, but potentially their only chance. "What if we don't run?" she said slowly. "What if we go to them instead? To Morrison? That's death. Not to Morrison, to your uncle, to Nalnish." Sarah's mind was racing now, seeing possibilities. "Diego said your uncle has been trying to negotiate peace. What if we brought Morrison to him, under a flag of truce? What if we forced them to talk?" Ayana stared at her as if she had suggested flying to the moon. Morrison would never agree to such a meeting, and even if he did, he would bring an army. He might agree if the alternative was losing face in front of the entire territory, and he might come with fewer men if he thought he was walking into a trap anyway. Sarah was thinking aloud now, working through the implications. "Your uncle wants peace. Morrison wants to look strong. Maybe there's a way to give them both what they need." The sound of horses was getting closer. Whatever they decided, they had to decide quickly. "There's a place," Ayana said finally, "sacred ground, where even enemies can meet safely according to Apache law. Morrison might not honor it, but my uncle would die before violating it." "How far?" 2 hours if we move carefully." "But Miss McKenna, you're talking about walking into a meeting between Apache warriors and angry white men. People die at such meetings." Sarah checked her small revolver. a gun she had purchased in Tucson, but never expected to use. Then we'll have to make sure this meeting is different. As they slipped out of the mine and began making their way through the broken terrain toward the sacred meeting ground, Sarah found herself thinking about Elena Martinez's grandmother and her stories about standing by while innocent people died. Sometimes, she realized, the most important lessons happen not in schoolhouses, but in moments when ordinary people decided to be extraordinary. Behind them, Morrison's search party was getting closer. Ahead lay the unknown territory of Apache sacred ground and the slim possibility of peace. Between them walked a Boston schoolteacher and a young Apache warrior, two people who should have been enemies, but had instead chosen to trust each other with their lives. By sunset, Sarah McKenna would either be dead or witness to something that would change the frontier forever. As they climbed toward the high country where Nalnish waited, she found herself hoping that courage, once kindled, might prove contagious. The meeting ground lay just ahead, marked by ancient petroglyphs and a silence that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. Soon she would learn whether justice could bloom in the desert or whether some hatreds ran too deep for even sacred ground to heal.